The gates had stopped rattling. For weeks, the women had grown used to the sound of distant artillery, a constant reminder that the war was collapsing around them. Then, one morning, silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind that made you hold your breath. Inside the barbed wire enclosure, over 200 captured auxiliary personnel, clerks, radio operators, nurses, mechanics, sat on wooden bunks, waiting for something none of them could define. They had been told stories, terrible stories, about what would happen when the Americans arrived. Some said they would be interrogated endlessly. Some said they would be punished. Others whispered they would simply disappear. So, when the trucks finally rolled in, no one moved. The uniforms were different, the accents unfamiliar. The soldiers looked younger than expected. One of the women, Annalise, later wrote that the strangest thing wasn't fear. It was confusion. The guards didn't shout. They didn't slam rifle stocks against the fence. They didn't separate anyone. Instead, one of the American officers looked at the camp commander's records, nodded quietly, and gave an order that made no sense at all. "Get them breakfast." The translator hesitated. "Breakfast, sir?" "Yes, hot." Inside the barracks, the women exchanged glances. Breakfast? No one had eaten a hot breakfast in months. It had to be a trick. One woman muttered, "They want us relaxed." Another whispered, "Maybe they'll question us while we eat." But when the first crates were carried through the gates, something didn't add up. The smell reached them before the food did. Fresh bread, coffee, and something sweet. That's when the fear shifted. Because tricks didn't usually smell like pancakes. The trays were set down one by one, metal against wood. That sound echoed louder than artillery ever had. Steam rose into the cold morning air. Real steam. Eggs, bread, thick slices of something that looked like bacon, a cup of dark coffee. For a long moment, no one touched anything. The American soldiers stepped back, not watching them like guards, but waiting. That made it worse. Annalisa stared at the plate in front of her. It looked unreal, too clean, too full, too generous. She whispered, "Don't." Across the table, Marta shook her head slightly. "It's not poison," someone muttered. But that wasn't the fear. The fear was humiliation. The fear was control. The fear was that the moment they showed hunger, the moment they reached for it, something would be taken from them. Weeks of survival had trained them not to trust kindness. One of the younger women quietly pushed the tray away. Another began to cry. Not loudly, just silently, staring at the food like it was something from another lifetime. The American officer noticed. He said something to the interpreter. The translator spoke gently. "You can eat. No one will stop you." Still, no one moved. Until something small happened. One of the older women, Frau Keller, slowly picked up a piece of bread. Not the eggs, not the meat, just the bread. Her hands trembled. She broke off a piece. Waited. Nothing happened. No shouting, no punishment, no orders, just silence. She placed it in her mouth and closed her eyes. That's when everything changed. Frau Keller kept chewing, slowly, carefully. Every pair of eyes at the table was on her, waiting for her to collapse, waiting for someone to shout, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. Nothing happened. She swallowed. Her hands were still shaking when she reached for another small piece. Across the yard, one of the American soldiers noticed the tension. He said something quietly to the officer beside him. The officer nodded once, then did something none of the women expected. He removed his helmet, not dramatically, not for show. He just took it off and held it under his arm. Then he walked forward, slowly, alone. No weapon raised, no shouting. The interpreter followed a few steps behind. The women stiffened. Several pushed their trays away again. The officer stopped several feet from the nearest table. He looked at them. Not over them. At them. The interpreter translated, "You are under protection now." Silence. The officer continued, "No one here will harm you. You will be treated according to the rules of war." That phrase hit differently. According to the rules. For months, rules had meant nothing. Orders had shifted. Promises had broken. Cities had fallen. Commanders had vanished. But this man spoke like rules still existed. One of the younger prisoners whispered, "Why?" The translator hesitated, then repeated the question. The officer answered without pause, "Because the war is ending, and someone has to start acting like it." The sentence didn't feel like propaganda. It felt tired. Round the yard, the atmosphere changed, Not suddenly, but subtly. More women lifted bread. Someone cautiously tasted the eggs. One of them began crying again, but this time openly. Not from fear, from exhaustion. Annalisa later wrote that what broke her wasn't the food. It was the way the soldiers turned their backs. They didn't watch them eat. They walked away to give them privacy. And in a place where dignity had slowly disappeared piece by piece. That was the moment something unfamiliar returned. Not trust, not forgiveness, but space to breathe. And for the first time in a long time. The food didn't taste like survival. It tasted like the future. The camp didn't transform overnight. No one suddenly smiled. No one forgot the months before. But something irreversible had happened. After breakfast, the Americans brought more than food. They brought paper, simple paper, and pencils. At first, no one understood why. The interpreter explained, "You may write to your families." The words moved through the yard slowly, like a rumor no one dared believe. Write? To home? Some of the women hadn't heard from their families in over a year. Cities had fallen. Mail routes had collapsed. Entire regions had vanished behind shifting front lines. Annalise held the pencil awkwardly. Her hands were stiff from labor and cold. The paper felt fragile. Too clean. What do you write when you don't know what still exists? Across the table, Marta stared at her blank page for several minutes before writing just 2 words. I am alive. Others followed. Some wrote carefully composed letters, trying to sound calm. Some wrote apologies. Some wrote nothing but names. The names of husbands, mothers, children, as if writing them kept them real. The American soldiers did something else unexpected. They organized medical checks. They distributed blankets. They allowed small groups to walk outside the inner fence under supervision, not as punishment, but as routine. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't freedom, but it was order, and order meant something stable. Later that afternoon, the officer returned one last time. No speech, no performance, just a simple statement through the interpreter. You will be transferred to a larger holding facility in a few days. Conditions there will be better. No cheers, no visible relief, just quiet processing. Because for the first time in months, the future wasn't a void. It had direction. As the sun began to lower behind the tents, the women sat again at the wooden tables. Not because they were told to, but because they chose to sit together. The same tables, the same yard. But the atmosphere was different. One of the younger prisoners looked at the empty tray in front of her and said softly, "This morning, I thought it was a trick." Frau Keller answered without looking up. "So did I." A pause. "But tricks don't let you write home." In her diary, years later, Annalisa described that breakfast not as the day she was fed, but as the day she understood something else. The war might have taken control of everything, but it hadn't taken away the possibility of being treated as human again. And sometimes, that's where rebuilding begins.